August 17th, 1937, 11:47 p.m. Basement interrogation room, Lubyanka Prison, Moscow. Marshal Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky, one of the Soviet Union's most brilliant military minds, sat handcuffed to a metal chair, his uniform torn and blood-stained. For the past 3 months, he had endured beatings, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture as NKVD interrogators demanded he sign confessions admitting to being a Polish spy and saboteur. The fluorescent light above buzzed and flickered, casting harsh shadows across his bruised face. When the interrogator slid the final confession across the table one more time, Rokossovsky looked up with defiant eyes and spoke words that would echo through the halls of the Kremlin and change the course of World War II. "If you want me to sign this, then you'll have to sign my death warrant too." What happened next would reveal the complex psychology of one of history's most ruthless dictators and demonstrate how a single moment of courage could alter the fate of millions. The story of what Stalin did after hearing these words begins not in 1937, but in 1936, when Stalin's paranoia had reached a fever pitch that would consume the Soviet military like wildfire. The Great Purge was devouring the Red Army's officer corps with terrifying efficiency. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin would eliminate 35 00 officers, including 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 Army commanders, 8 of 9 admirals, 50 of 57 Army Corps commanders, and 154 of 186 division commanders. The mathematics were staggering and suicidal. The Soviet Union was dismantling its own defense apparatus at the precise moment when Nazi Germany was building the most powerful military machine in history. Yet Stalin continued, driven by a paranoid belief that foreign agents had infiltrated every level of Soviet society, particularly among officers with international experience or foreign backgrounds. Konstantin Rokossovsky was exactly the type of officer who attracted Stalin's deadly attention. Born in 1896 in Warsaw, when it was part of the Russian Empire, he had served as a cavalry officer in World War I, joined the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, and distinguished himself as a brilliant tactical commander. His Polish birth made him suspect. His intelligence made him dangerous, and his popularity among troops made him a potential threat to Stalin's absolute control. By 1937, as Stalin's purge machine identified its next targets, Rokossovsky's name appeared on lists compiled by NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov. The arrest came at dawn on August 17, 1937, when black cars surrounded Rokossovsky's Moscow apartment and armed agents dragged him from his bed while his wife watched in terror. The interrogation process that followed was designed to break even the strongest men through a combination of physical torture, sleep deprivation, and psychological manipulation. NKVD interrogators had perfected techniques that could force confessions from almost anyone within weeks or days. They would beat prisoners with rubber hoses that left no visible marks, keep them awake for days by forcing them to stand in tiny cells, and threaten their families with arrest and execution. The confessions they sought followed a standard template. The accused would admit to being recruited by foreign intelligence services, would name other conspirators, and would detail specific acts of sabotage or espionage. Most officers signed within a week. Many signed within days. The alternative was usually death after months of torture. Rokossovsky proved different from the start. For 3 months, he endured beatings that broke several ribs and knocked out 9 of his teeth. Interrogators would wake him every 20 minutes for weeks, forcing him to stand in a cell so small he couldn't sit down. They showed him photographs of his wife and daughter, threatening to arrest them as accomplices unless he cooperated. They brought in other prisoners who begged him to sign so their own torture would stop. Yet, Rokossovsky refused to confess to crimes he hadn't committed or to implicate innocent colleagues in fabricated conspiracies. His interrogators reported to their superiors that this particular prisoner was proving unusually resistant to standard techniques. The confession document that interrogators finally placed before Rokossovsky in late November 1937 contained accusations that would have justified his execution and the arrest of dozens of other officers. According to the document, he had been recruited by Polish intelligence in 1920, had sabotaged Red Army training exercises throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and had built a network of conspirators planning to assassinate Stalin and surrender Soviet territory to Poland and Germany. The document named specific dates, locations, and co-conspirators, all fabricated by NKVD analysts who specialized in creating believable espionage narratives. If signed, this confession would not only seal Rokossovsky's fate, but provide evidence for dozens of additional arrests and executions. When the interrogator pushed the document across the table for what he announced would be the final time, Rokossovsky read through the accusations carefully. His face showed the strain of 3 months of torture. His hands trembled from exhaustion, and his voice was hoarse from countless interrogation sessions. But when he looked up at his interrogator, his eyes burned with defiant clarity. "You want me to sign this confession?" he asked. "Then you'll have to sign my death warrant too, because I will not put my name to lies." The interrogator, trained to break the strongest wills, found himself facing something he had rarely encountered, a man who would choose death over dishonor. The interrogator immediately reported this response to his superiors, who escalated the report through NKVD channels until it reached Yezhov himself. Yezhov, understanding the implications of a high-profile military figure maintaining innocence under extreme torture, made a decision that would normally have been automatic. He recommended immediate execution. But Stalin's response, when the report reached his desk in the Kremlin, surprised even veteran NKVD officials. Instead of signing the execution order, Stalin wrote a single word across the document. Wait. For the first time during the Great Purge, the Soviet dictator seemed to pause before eliminating a senior military officer who refused to confess. If you want to see how one man's refusal to sign false confessions created a crack in Stalin's terror machine that would eventually help save the Soviet Union, please leave your like on this video. This helps YouTube show these forgotten stories to more people. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already to not miss the next episodes. What followed Stalin's decision to wait remains one of the most psychologically fascinating episodes of the Stalin era. For weeks, Rokossovsky remained in his cell while Stalin apparently wrestled with a decision that went against every instinct of his paranoid mind. NKVD records, partially declassified in the 1990s, show that Stalin requested additional background checks on Rokossovsky, ordered reviews of his military service record, and even had agents interview soldiers who had served under his command. The results painted a picture of an officer whose loyalty to the Soviet Union was beyond question and whose military capabilities were exceptional. Multiple reports described Rokossovsky as one of the Red Army's most competent commanders, particularly skilled in armored warfare and combined operations. Stalin's hesitation became even more significant as international tensions escalated throughout 1938. German military expansion was accelerating. Japanese forces were engaged in border conflicts with Soviet troops in the Far East, and intelligence reports suggested that major war was inevitable within years. The purge of the officer corps, while satisfying Stalin's paranoid need for control, was creating dangerous capability gaps in Soviet military leadership. Every executed marshal and general represented years of military experience and institutional knowledge that could not be quickly replaced. Stalin, despite his paranoia, understood that fighting a modern war required experienced commanders who understood both Soviet doctrine and enemy capabilities. The turning point came in March 1938, when Germany annexed Austria and made clear its intentions toward Czechoslovakia. Stalin, reviewing intelligence reports about German military preparations, apparently realized that the Soviet Union might soon face the most dangerous military threat in its history with a decimated officer corps. According to memoirs published years later by Georgy Zhukov and other surviving Soviet commanders, Stalin began quietly questioning some of his advisors about the wisdom of executing all officers with significant military experience. The questions reportedly focused on whether the Soviet Union could defend itself with an officer corps consisting primarily of inexperienced commanders promoted rapidly to fill positions left vacant by purge victims. How many of you have a grandfather, father, or uncle who served and never spoke about what they experienced? These stories are disappearing. Leave a comment now saying simply, "My family remembers." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family, you're preserving memory for future generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. In April 1938, Stalin made a decision that shocked NKVD officials and began one of the most unlikely rehabilitations in Soviet history. Instead of signing Rokossovsky's execution order, Stalin ordered his release from Lubyanka prison and his reinstatement in the Red Army with full rank and privileges. The official explanation, according to NKVD documents, was that new evidence had cleared Rokossovsky of all charges and revealed that accusations against him had been fabricated by enemies of the people within the security apparatus itself. Several of Rokossovsky's interrogators were themselves arrested, tried, and executed for anti-Soviet activities and falsification of evidence. The speed of this reversal suggested that Stalin wanted to eliminate any witnesses to his decision-making process during Rokossovsky's case. Rokossovsky's release came with specific conditions that revealed Stalin's calculating mind. He was assigned to command a mechanized corps in the Kiev military district, far from Moscow, but close to the Polish border, where his knowledge of local geography and culture would be valuable. Stalin personally met with Rokossovsky before his departure, a meeting described in Soviet archives as cordial and focused on military matters rather than the circumstances of his imprisonment. According to these records, Stalin asked Rokossovsky specific questions about German armor tactics, Soviet tank development, and the Red Army's preparedness for mechanized warfare. The dictator appeared to be testing whether months of torture had damaged Rokossovsky's analytical capabilities or military expertise. The rehabilitation proved even more significant as Stalin began quietly reviewing cases of other imprisoned military officers. Between April and December 1938, approximately 3 Rokossovsky arrested officers were released from NKVD custody and reinstated in various positions. While this number was small compared to the 35 Zero-Lotra officers eliminated during the purge, it represented a tacit admission that the terror campaign had gone too far in destroying military capability. Stalin never publicly acknowledged this reversal, but internal documents suggest he understood that defending the Soviet Union required experienced commanders, regardless of their political reliability. Rokossovsky's return to active duty immediately demonstrated Stalin's wisdom in sparing him. His mechanized corps quickly became known as one of the most effective units in the Red Army, with innovations in tank tactics and combined arms operations that would prove crucial during the coming war. Rokossovsky implemented training programs that emphasized rapid movement, concentrated armor attacks, and coordination between tanks, artillery, and infantry that reflected his study of German blitzkrieg tactics. Reports from war games and exercises throughout 1939 consistently rated his corps among the best-prepared units in the Soviet military, validating Stalin's decision to preserve his expertise. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and the Soviet Union occupied eastern Poland under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Rokossovsky's corps participated in operations that gave him first-hand experience with German military methods. His reports to Moscow described German tactical innovations, equipment capabilities, and operational doctrine with the analytical precision that had made him valuable before his arrest. These reports, preserved in Soviet military archives, provided Stalin and the General Staff with some of the most accurate intelligence about German military capabilities available to any Allied nation in 1939. The ultimate vindication of Stalin's decision came on June 22, 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union with 8 million troops, 350 tanks, and 2,770 aircraft. The massive surprise attack caught most of the Red Army unprepared and destroyed entire divisions in the opening weeks. Soviet forces retreated hundreds of miles, lost thousands of tanks and aircraft, and suffered casualties that threatened the survival of the Soviet state. In this desperate situation, Stalin turned to the commanders he had spared from the purge, including Rokossovsky, who would prove instrumental in stopping the German advance and eventually driving Nazi forces back to Berlin. Rokossovsky's performance during the critical Battle of Moscow in December 1941 demonstrated exactly why Stalin's decision to spare him had been strategically brilliant. Commanding the 16th Army, Rokossovsky organized the defense of the Volokholamsk-Istra sector northwest of Moscow, one of the main German approaches to the Soviet capital. His forces, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, conducted a fighting withdrawal that inflicted severe casualties on German units while preserving Soviet combat capability. When Stalin ordered the winter counteroffensive that pushed German forces back from Moscow, Rokossovsky's army spearheaded attacks that recaptured key towns and demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. Throughout 1942 and 1943, as the war reached its turning point, Rokossovsky continued to validate Stalin's faith in his abilities. He commanded key sectors during the Battle of Stalingrad, where his tactical skill helped encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, he commanded the Central Front that absorbed the main German offensive and then launched counterattacks that broke the back of German armored reserves. His performance earned him promotion to Marshal of the Soviet Union and recognition as one of the Red Army's most capable commanders. Stalin, who rarely praised subordinates, reportedly told other generals that Rokossovsky's survival proved that sometimes the best way to test loyalty is to give a man the chance to prove it. The psychological impact of Rokossovsky's case extended far beyond military affairs to influence Stalin's approach to governing the Soviet Union. The dictator's decision to spare an officer who refused to confess represented a rare moment when practical necessity overcame ideological paranoia. This pattern would repeat throughout the war, as Stalin increasingly prioritized competence over political reliability in military appointments. Generals like Georgy Zhukov, who had also survived brushes with NKVD suspicion, found themselves given unprecedented authority to conduct military operations without constant political interference. After the war, Rokossovsky's relationship with Stalin became even more complex as geopolitical considerations shaped the dictator's decisions about his subordinates. In 1945, Stalin appointed Rokossovsky as commander of Soviet occupation forces in Poland, a position that required both military expertise and political sensitivity. The appointment reflected Stalin's understanding that controlling Eastern Europe required commanders who could balance military effectiveness with diplomatic skill. Rokossovsky's Polish background, which had nearly led to his execution in 1937, became an asset in managing relationships with Polish political leaders and implementing Soviet policies in occupied territory. The broader implications of Stalin's decision to spare Rokossovsky resonated throughout the post-war period as the Soviet Union emerged as a global superpower. The generals who survived the purge and proved themselves during World War II became the foundation of Soviet military leadership during the Cold War. Their experience in mechanized warfare, combined arms operations, and large-scale strategic planning provided the expertise needed to develop nuclear doctrine, missile programs, and conventional forces capable of competing with NATO. Stalin's decision to preserve military expertise, even when it conflicted with his paranoid instincts, contributed to the Soviet Union's emergence as a military superpower that could challenge American global dominance. Rokossovsky himself continued to serve in senior positions until Stalin's death in 1953, commanding military districts and serving on the general staff that developed Soviet defense strategy for the emerging Cold War. His survival and success became a model for other Soviet leaders who learned to balance personal loyalty with professional competence. The lesson that Stalin could spare those who proved their value through performance rather than political submission influenced how Soviet officials approached their relationships with supreme leadership throughout the remainder of the communist era. The story of Rokossovsky's confrontation with Stalin and its aftermath reveals fundamental truths about leadership under extreme pressure and the complex calculations that dictators make when balancing control with competence. Stalin's decision to spare a subordinate who openly defied him demonstrated that even the most paranoid leaders must sometimes prioritize practical necessity over ideological purity. For Rokossovsky, refusing to sign false confessions despite facing certain death showed that maintaining personal integrity could sometimes produce better outcomes than submission to authority. The historical significance of this episode extends beyond the personalities involved to illustrate how individual acts of courage can influence major historical events. Rokossovsky's refusal to confess and Stalin's surprising decision to spare him helped preserve military expertise that proved crucial to Soviet survival during World War II. Without experienced commanders like Rokossovsky, the Red Army might have been unable to stop German advances or conduct the complex operations that eventually drove Nazi forces out of Soviet territory and back to Berlin. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky died on August 3, 1968, at the age of 71, having served his country through some of the most dangerous periods in Russian history. His funeral in Moscow was attended by thousands of veterans who remembered his leadership during the war and his integrity during the terror of the Purge years. The man who had faced Stalin's interrogators and refused to sign false confessions became a symbol of how personal courage could survive even the most brutal political systems. The prison cell where Rokossovsky endured 3 months of torture no longer exists, demolished along with parts of Lubyanka prison during renovations in the 1960s. But the interrogation transcripts, preserved in Soviet archives and partially declassified after 1991, remain as testimony to what happened when an honest man faced absolute power and chose truth over survival. These documents, fragile and yellowed with age, contain some of the most powerful evidence available about how ordinary people maintained their humanity under extraordinary pressure. The larger lesson of Rokossovsky's story speaks to the eternal tension between truth and power, between integrity and survival, between standing firm and bending to authority. In a system designed to break individual will and force submission to state authority, one man's refusal to sign false confessions created a crack in the machinery of terror that ultimately helped save his nation. His example proves that sometimes the most powerful resistance to tyranny comes not from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but from quiet refusal to participate in lies. The story of what Stalin did after Rokossovsky said, "Then you'll have to sign my death warrant too," ultimately demonstrates that even dictators must sometimes choose competence over control, that even paranoid leaders must occasionally trust their subordinates, and that individual courage can sometimes change the course of history. In a world where power often seems to crush principle and where survival appears to require moral compromise, Rokossovsky's defiance reminds us that maintaining integrity, even at the cost of life itself, can sometimes produce outcomes that no amount of calculation or submission could achieve. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, please do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Each like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about officers who refused to break under torture, leaders who chose competence over paranoia, soldiers who changed history through courage and integrity. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Russia, Poland, Germany, Canada. Our community extends around the world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if anyone in your family served. Just tell us you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Konstantin Rokossovsky doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible. This content is based on historical records, but includes educational interpretation and dramatic elements for storytelling purposes. The psychological shockwaves of Stalin's decision to spare Rokossovsky reverberated through every level of the Soviet terror apparatus, with consequences that extended far beyond a single prisoner's fate. NKVD officers who had spent years perfecting techniques of interrogation and execution suddenly found themselves questioning the very foundations of their work. If a prisoner who openly defied confessing could be released and reinstated, what did that mean for the thousands of others who had signed false statements under torture? The implications were staggering and dangerous for men whose careers depended on the absolute certainty that the state's enemies must be eliminated regardless of their protests of innocence. Senior NKVD officials like Vsevolod Merkelov and Ivan Serov privately expressed concerns that Stalin's reversal in the Rokossovsky case could undermine the entire foundation of state security operations. Internal memos from this period, discovered in KGB archives after the Soviet collapse, reveal heated debates about whether other high-profile military prisoners should be reconsidered for release. Some officers argued that maintaining the terror's psychological impact required consistent follow-through on all arrests, while others suggested that preserving military expertise might require selective mercy for the most capable commanders. These debates reflected a broader uncertainty within the security apparatus about Stalin's true priorities. As international tensions mounted, the impact on other prisoners in NKVD custody was equally profound and tragic. Word of Rokossovsky's release spread through the prison system like wildfire, carried by guards, interrogators, and transferred prisoners who had witnessed his defiance. For many inmates who had already signed confessions, the news brought crushing realization that their survival strategy had been unnecessary and their betrayals of colleagues had been pointless. Prison logs from Lubyanka and other facilities record a surge in suicide attempts during the weeks following Rokossovsky's release, as prisoners struggled with the knowledge that maintaining innocence might have saved them while confession had sealed their fates. Among the military officers still facing interrogation, Rokossovsky's example produced mixed results that revealed the complex psychology of men under extreme duress. Some found courage in his defiance and began retracting their confessions, demanding new hearings and insisting on their innocence despite facing additional torture for their resistance. Others, already broken by weeks or months of abuse, found the news of his release an additional torment that highlighted their own perceived weakness in signing false statements. The prison system, designed to operate with mechanical efficiency in processing confessions and executions, suddenly faced unprecedented complications as prisoners began demanding the same consideration that Rokossovsky had received. The process of Rokossovsky's reintegration into Soviet military life required careful management that reflected Stalin's understanding of how other officers would interpret his rehabilitation. Rather than simply returning him to his previous position, Stalin orchestrated a gradual restoration that would demonstrate both mercy and continued control. Rokossovsky was initially assigned to relatively minor positions where his performance could be closely monitored, then progressively given greater responsibility as he proved his continued competence and loyalty. This careful choreography served multiple purposes. It showed other officers that redemption was possible while maintaining Stalin's authority to grant or withdraw favor at will. The broader military establishment watched Rokossovsky's return with a mixture of hope and apprehension that reflected their own precarious positions in Stalin's system. Officers who had survived the purges by keeping low profiles suddenly had to recalculate their survival strategies in light of evidence that competence might sometimes outweigh political reliability. Some interpreted his rehabilitation as a signal that Stalin valued military expertise more highly than they had believed, leading to more assertive behavior in proposing tactical innovations or questioning ineffective orders. Others viewed his return as an anomaly that proved nothing about their own chances of survival if they fell under suspicion. Rokossovsky himself faced the psychological challenge of returning to normal duties after experiencing the depths of Stalin's terror machine. Medical records from his reinstatement physical examination, preserved in Soviet military archives, document the lasting physical damage from his imprisonment. Multiple healed fractures, dental injuries, and signs of prolonged malnutrition and sleep deprivation. But perhaps more significantly, colleagues noted changes in his personality and leadership style that reflected his traumatic experience. Officers who had served under him before his arrest described him as more cautious in political discussions, more protective of subordinates who showed initiative, and more willing to take personal risks to shield others from potential accusations of disloyalty. The strategic implications of preserving commanders like Rokossovsky became apparent during the war's most critical battles, where their experience and tactical innovation proved decisive in stopping German advances. At the Battle of Kursk, Rokossovsky's ability to coordinate complex defensive operations across hundreds of miles of front line demonstrated exactly the kind of operational expertise that the purge had nearly eliminated. His forces absorbed the main German armored assault, then launched counterattacks that destroyed irreplaceable panzer divisions and marked the beginning of Germany's irreversible retreat on the Eastern Front. Military historians estimate that without experienced commanders like Rokossovsky, Soviet forces might have collapsed during the crucial battles of 1942 and 1943, potentially allowing Germany to achieve the quick victory that Hitler's strategy required. The long-term consequences of Stalin's decision extended into the post-war period as the Soviet Union emerged as a global superpower requiring sophisticated military leadership to compete with the United States and NATO. The generals who had survived the purge and proven themselves during the war became the foundation of Soviet strategic planning during the Cold War, developing doctrine for nuclear warfare, conventional operations, and proxy conflicts around the world. Their experience in large-scale mechanized warfare provided crucial expertise for understanding how modern military technology could be integrated with traditional Soviet tactical principles. Rokossovsky's survival and success became a case study in Soviet military education, taught to officers as an example of how personal integrity and professional competence could sometimes overcome even the most dangerous political circumstances. His refusal to sign false confessions initially seen as suicidal defiance, became a model for how military professionals should maintain their principles while serving an authoritarian state. This lesson influenced generations of Soviet officers who learned to balance loyalty to the state with commitment to military professionalism and personal honor. The broader historical significance of the Rokossovsky case lies in what it reveals about the internal contradictions of totalitarian systems that must balance ideological purity with practical effectiveness. Stalin's decision to spare a subordinate who openly defied him demonstrated that even the most ruthless dictators must sometimes choose competence over control when facing existential threats. This tension between political reliability and professional capability would continue to shape Soviet military policy throughout the Cold War. As leaders struggled to maintain both ideological conformity and military effectiveness in an increasingly complex international environment.